Baby found a bear cub sealed inside a shipping crate. What Baby did next was pure courage. The old wooden crate sat in the corner of the Marshall family's backyard like it had always belonged there, though Ethan knew for certain it hadn't been there yesterday morning. The weathered planks looked ancient, stained with what might have been ocean salt or maybe just time itself. And there was something about the way the afternoon sunlight caught on its surface that made it seem to shimmer slightly, as if it couldn't quite decide whether it was solid or something else entirely. 3-year-old Lily Morgan was visiting for the weekend while her parents were away, and she had been the first to notice it, tugging on Ethan's sleeve with her tiny fingers and pointing with that serious expression only toddlers could manage when they discovered something truly important. "Box?" she had said simply, but there was something in her voice, something that made Ethan set down his coffee and follow her outside into the warm September air. The crate was about 4 feet tall and 3 feet wide, constructed from wood that looked like it had traveled through storms and sunshine for decades, maybe longer. Strange symbols were carved into its sides, not quite letters and not quite pictures, but something in between that seemed to shift slightly when you weren't looking directly at them. Ethan ran his fingers along the grooves, feeling an odd warmth beneath his touch, like the wood was alive somehow, breathing slowly in the afternoon heat. Lily stood beside him, her small hand resting on the crate's corner, and she tilted her head as if she was listening to something only she could hear. "Music," she whispered, and when Ethan leaned closer he heard it too, a soft, rhythmic humming that seemed to come from inside the crate itself, not mechanical but organic, like a heartbeat or maybe like breathing, steady and calm and somehow reassuring. The lock on the crate was unlike anything Ethan had seen before, a complex mechanism of interlocking circles that seemed to have no keyhole, no obvious way to open it. But as Lily reached up to touch it with her chubby fingers, the circles began to glow with a soft blue light, rotating slowly as if recognizing something in her touch. Ethan felt his heart skip, not from fear, but from a strange sense of anticipation, like standing at the edge of a discovery that would change everything. The circles continued to turn, creating patterns that reminded him of constellations he'd seen in astronomy books, and then, with a gentle click that sounded almost like a sigh, the lock fell away. The front panel of the crate swung open on silent hinges, revealing darkness that seemed deeper than it should be, and from within came a sound that made both Ethan and Lily step back, not a growl or a threat, but a soft, questioning chirp, like a bird calling out in an unfamiliar forest. What emerged from the darkness made Ethan's rational mind struggle to process what his eyes were seeing. It looked like a bear cub at first glance, covered in fur that seemed to shimmer between brown and gold, depending on how the light hit it. But there was something else, something that made it clear this was no ordinary animal. Its eyes were too intelligent, too aware, holding depths of understanding that no earthly creature should possess. The fur itself seemed to move independently sometimes, rippling with patterns that looked almost like star maps, and when it breathed, tiny sparkles of light seemed to dance in the air around its nose. The creature, for Ethan couldn't think of what else to call it, stepped out of the crate with movements that were both graceful and slightly uncertain, as if gravity worked differently where it came from. It was about the size of a 6-month-old bear cub, but its proportions were subtly different, more elegant somehow, and its paws, when they touched the grass, left brief impressions that glowed faintly before fading. Lily showed no fear at all, which both amazed and worried Ethan in equal measure. She walked right up to the creature with the confidence only a 3-year-old could have, her arms outstretched in the universal gesture of a child wanting to give a hug. The creature tilted its head, studying her with those impossibly deep eyes, and then did something that made Ethan's breath catch in his throat. It smiled. Not a human smile exactly, but an expression of such genuine warmth and recognition that it transcended species entirely. When Lily wrapped her small arms around its neck, the creature's fur seemed to pulse with a gentle light, and Ethan heard that humming sound again, but louder now, more musical, like a lullaby being sung in a language that predated words. "Friend," Lily said with absolute certainty, and the creature made a sound that might have been agreement, a soft rumbling purr that Ethan felt in his chest more than heard with his ears. The rest of that first day passed in a kind of dreamlike wonder. The creature, which Lily had immediately named Star for reasons she couldn't quite articulate, but that seemed perfectly appropriate given the way its fur sparkled, explored the backyard with careful curiosity. It examined flowers with an intensity that suggested it was seeing colors humans couldn't perceive. And when it touched the old oak tree in the corner of the yard, the leaves seemed to rustle with a wind that wasn't there. Ethan found himself calling his neighbor Jessica Brooks, not to alarm her, but because he needed someone else to see this, to confirm he wasn't losing his mind. Jessica arrived within minutes, her skepticism evident until she saw Star for herself, and then her expression shifted from doubt to wonder in the space of a heartbeat. "What is it?" she whispered, watching as Star and Lily played a game that seemed to involve chasing light patterns only they could see. Ethan could only shake his head, having no answer that made sense. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed especially vivid that evening, Star's behavior changed subtly. The creature moved closer to Lily, who had been sitting on the porch steps eating crackers, and began to emit a soft glow from its fur. Not bright or alarming, but gentle, like moonlight filtered through clouds. Lily giggled and reached out to touch the glowing fur, and when she did, something extraordinary happened. Images appeared in the air around them, translucent and shimmering like heat mirages but perfectly clear. Images of a place that was definitely not Earth. Ethan saw crystalline structures that might have been cities, beings that looked similar to Star but adult and majestic, and skies filled with colors that had no names in any human language. The images lasted only moments, but they left an impression that would never fade, a glimpse into a reality larger and more beautiful than anything Ethan had imagined possible. That night, Star slept curled up next to Lily's bed, and Ethan found himself unable to leave them alone, setting up a chair in the corner of the room to keep watch. Not because he feared Star would harm Lily, quite the opposite. There was something protective about the creature's presence, something that made the room feel safer than it ever had before. As he watched them sleep, Star's fur pulsing gently with that inner light in rhythm with its breathing, Ethan noticed something else. The air in the room seemed different, cleaner somehow, and filled with a faint scent like ozone after a summer storm mixed with something floral he couldn't identify. Every now and then, Star would make soft sounds in its sleep, not quite words, but almost, as if it was dreaming in a language of pure emotion. Lily, for her part, slept more peacefully than Ethan had ever seen her. One small hand resting on Star's glowing fur, her face serene with the kind of contentment that only comes from feeling completely, absolutely safe. The second day brought new revelations and deepened the mystery of their unusual visitor. Star seemed to be learning about their world with remarkable speed, watching television with an intensity that suggested it was absorbing not just the images but something deeper, perhaps the electromagnetic signals themselves. When Ethan turned on the radio, Star's ears perked up and it began to sway slightly. Not to the music, but to something else it was hearing within the broadcast. Jessica came by again, bringing her daughter Savannah Reed, who was visiting, and the 4-year-old girl showed the same fearless fascination with Star that Lily had. The two children played with the creature in the backyard, and Ethan noticed that wherever Star walked, the grass seemed to grow a little greener, a little healthier, as if its presence was somehow nourishing to living things. Even the old rose bush that hadn't bloomed in years suddenly burst forth with flowers, their petals showing colors that seemed impossibly vivid. By the 3rd day, a routine of sorts had developed, though calling anything about this situation routine seemed absurd. Star had shown them more of those translucent images, and Ethan was beginning to piece together a story, though whether it was true or just his interpretation, he couldn't be sure. Star seemed to be young, perhaps separated from its kind, though not lost exactly, more like sent with purpose, though what that purpose might be remained unclear. The creature had also begun to communicate more directly, not with words, but with feelings that appeared in your mind fully formed. Complete thoughts that bypassed language entirely. Through this strange telepathy, Ethan learned that Star's kind were travelers, explorers of a sort, but not in the way humans understood exploration. They traveled between spaces that weren't quite places, looking for something Star's young mind couldn't quite explain, something about connections and harmony and notes in a cosmic song that needed to be properly tuned. The attachment between Lily and Star grew stronger each day, and Ethan found himself torn between wonder and worry. What would happen when Lily's parents returned? How could he possibly explain this? But more importantly, he sensed that Star's time with them was limited, though he couldn't say how he knew this. There was something about the way the creature would sometimes stare at the sky, particularly at night when certain stars were visible, that suggested it was waiting for something, or perhaps listening for a call only it could hear. These moments filled Ethan with a preemptive sadness, knowing that saying goodbye to Star would break Lily's heart, and if he was honest, his own as well. The creature had brought something magical into their ordinary lives, had shown them that the universe was far stranger and more wonderful than they had ever imagined, and the thought of returning to a world without that magic seemed unbearably gray. On the 4th day, things began to change in subtle but unmistakable ways. Star's fur was glowing more frequently now, and the images it shared were becoming more urgent, though still gentle. Ethan saw what he thought might be Star's family, beings of incredible beauty and grace, and he felt their concern, their call for their young one to return. But he also felt Star's reluctance, its attachment to Lily, and the genuine love that had developed between them. It was a love that transcended species, transcended worlds, pure and simple and absolutely real. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Star did something new. It touched its nose to Lily's hand, and suddenly she was glowing too, surrounded by a soft aura of light that made her laugh with delight. "Pretty," she said, watching the light dance around her fingers, and Star made that purring sound that Ethan had come to recognize as happiness. Jessica had started bringing other neighbors by, carefully chosen people she trusted, and each reacted with the same progression of disbelief, wonder, and finally acceptance. Logan Carter from down the street, a retired science teacher, sat for hours just observing Star, taking notes in a journal with hands that shook slightly from excitement. "This changes everything," he kept muttering, though when pressed to explain what exactly it changed, he could only gesture helplessly at Star and say, "Everything we thought we knew about what's possible." His wife, Avery Johnson, usually practical to a fault, found herself sitting on the grass letting Star rest its head in her lap, tears streaming down her face as she felt the creature's emotional communications, messages of peace and belonging that touched something deep in her soul she hadn't even known was there. The fifth day brought a development that Ethan had been both expecting and dreading. Star began to build something in the backyard, using materials that seemed to appear from nowhere, or rather, from the same strange space the creature itself had come from. It wasn't construction in any conventional sense, but more like weaving, creating patterns in the air that solidified into something that looked like a cross between a cocoon and a doorway. The structure pulsed with the same inner light as Star's fur, and when Ethan stood near it, he could hear that humming sound more clearly, could feel it resonating in his bones. Star worked with intense concentration, occasionally pausing to nuzzle Lily, who watched with solemn attention as if she understood what was happening even if she couldn't articulate it. "Star, going home?" she asked once, and the creature's eyes seemed to fill with an emotion that was unmistakably sadness mixed with necessity. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He stood at the window watching Star and Lily in the backyard, illuminated by the gentle glow of the structure Star had built. They were playing their light pattern game again, but it seemed different now, more like Star was teaching Lily something, passing on some kind of knowledge or perhaps just memories to carry forward. The sight filled him with a bittersweet ache, knowing that this magical chapter in their lives was coming to an end. But there was beauty in it too, in the way Lily showed no possessiveness, no desire to keep Star against its will. Even at 3 years old, she seemed to understand that love sometimes meant letting go, that the greatest gift you could give someone you loved was the freedom to follow their path, even if that path led away from you. On the 6th day, the structure Star had built began to pulse more rapidly, and Ethan knew the time had come. He called Jessica, who arrived with Savannah, and Logan and Avery came too, forming a small circle of witnesses to what they all sensed would be an extraordinary farewell. Star moved among them, touching each person gently with its nose, and with each touch came a flood of images and emotions, gratitude, love, and promise that though they might never meet again in physical form, the connection formed here would endure across whatever distances or dimensions separated them. When Star reached Lily, it paused, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other, communicating in that wordless way they had developed. Then Lily did something that surprised everyone. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small toy, a plastic star she had been carrying around since she was 2, and pressed it into Star's paw. The creature looked at the toy with such tenderness that Ethan felt tears spring to his eyes. As the sun set on that 6th day, the structure Star had built began to glow more brightly, and a doorway opened within it. Not a normal doorway, but a passage to somewhere else, somewhere that hurt to look at directly, because human eyes weren't meant to process those kinds of dimensions. Through it, Ethan caught glimpses of Star's world, and it was beautiful beyond description, filled with colors that didn't exist on Earth and structures that defied geometry as he understood it. Beings like Star, but larger, more radiant, appeared at the threshold, and he felt their gratitude washing over him, thanking him for caring for their young one. Star made one last circuit of the gathered humans, its fur blazing with light now, leaving each of them with a final gift, a small stone that glowed with inner fire, warm to the touch and pulsing with that familiar rhythm they had all come to associate with their visitor. The moment of departure was both heartbreaking and magnificent. Star paused at the threshold of the doorway, looked back at Lily one last time, and made a sound that was unmistakably a promise. Not goodbye, but until we meet again. Though when or how that might be, none of them could guess. Lily waved, her small hand steady and brave, and called out, "Love you, Star," in her clear child's voice. The creature's form seemed to shimmer with emotion, and then it stepped through the doorway, which immediately began to collapse in on itself. Not violently but gently, like a flower closing its petals for the night. Within moments, there was nothing left but a circle of grass that glowed faintly in the growing darkness, and the small stones in their hands, warm and comforting and absolutely real. Proof that it hadn't been a dream. In the days that followed, life returned to something resembling normal, though Ethan knew it would never truly be the same. Lily carried her glowing stone everywhere, and sometimes at night he would find her holding it up to the stars, as if sending messages to her friend across the cosmos. The grass where Star had walked remained unusually green and vibrant, and the roses continued to bloom with those impossible colors. Jessica started a journal, documenting everything they could remember, though they all agreed to keep it private, knowing the world wasn't ready for this truth. Logan spent hours studying his stone under various instruments, finding properties that shouldn't exist according to known physics, while Avery simply kept hers on her nightstand, finding comfort in its gentle glow during sleepless nights. A week after Star's departure, something remarkable happened. Lily was playing in the backyard when she suddenly stopped and pointed at the sky. "Star!" she exclaimed. And when Ethan looked up, he saw it, a new star in the constellation Ursa Minor, glowing with a familiar golden light, pulsing in that rhythm they all knew so well. It hadn't been there before, he was certain of it, and when he checked his astronomy apps, they showed nothing in that position. But it was there, visible to anyone who knew to look for it, a permanent reminder of their temporary visitor. That night, as he tucked Lily into bed, she held her glowing stone up to the window, and the new star seemed to pulse in response, a communication across impossible distances that made perfect sense to a 3-year-old's heart. The experience with Star had changed them all in subtle but profound ways. Ethan found himself more patient, more aware of the magic in everyday moments, knowing now that extraordinary things could happen when you least expected them. He started taking Lily on more nature walks, teaching her to really see the world around them, to notice the small miracles that most people overlooked. She would often stop to examine flowers or insects with the same intensity Star had shown, as if she was seeing through multiple dimensions of reality. Sometimes she would make observations that seemed too profound for a 3-year-old, talking about how everything was connected by invisible threads of light, how every living thing had its own song that contributed to a greater harmony. Whether these were her own insights or something Star had left behind in her consciousness, Ethan couldn't say, but he treasured these moments of wisdom from such a small soul. Jessica and her daughter Savannah became regular visitors, and the 4 of them would often sit in the backyard in the evenings, watching the stars and sharing their memories of Star. Savannah had started drawing pictures of their visitor, and while children's drawings were often fanciful, hers captured something essential about Star that photographs never could have, the sense of otherness combined with absolute belonging, the way the creature had been both alien and family at the same time. The drawings covered Jessica's refrigerator, a gallery of remembered magic that made everyone who saw them pause and wonder what story lay behind these images of a glowing, bear-like creature playing with laughing children under impossible stars. Logan and Avery had been transformed too, their retirement taking on a new dimension of purpose. Logan had begun corresponding with other scientists online, carefully feeling out whether anyone else had experienced similar encounters. Never quite revealing their own story, but gathering hints that perhaps Star's kind had visited Earth before, leaving traces in folklore and mythology that had been dismissed as fantasy. Avery had started a garden, inspired by the way plants had responded to Star's presence, and found that her green thumb had mysteriously improved, as if some of Star's life-enhancing energy had transferred to her through their brief connection. Their home became a gathering place for the small group who had shared the experience, a safe space where they could talk about it without fear of being thought crazy. 3 months after Star's departure, Lily's parents returned from their extended trip, and Ethan faced the challenge of explaining why their daughter now carried a glowing stone everywhere and insisted on saying goodnight to a particular star every evening. To his surprise, they accepted the story more easily than he had expected. Perhaps because the evidence was hard to deny, the stone that glowed with no apparent power source, the circle of extraordinarily vibrant grass in Ethan's backyard, and most of all, the change in Lily herself. She had always been a bright child, but now there was something more, a depth of understanding and empathy that seemed beyond her years. She would comfort crying children at the playground with a wisdom that made adults stop and listen. And animals were drawn to her in a way that suggested they recognized something special about her. The seasons changed, autumn giving way to winter, but the circle of grass where Star's portal had been never stopped growing, even under snow. It became a neighborhood curiosity, though only the inner circle knew its true origin. On clear winter nights, Ethan would bundle Lily up, and they would stand in that circle, looking up at Star's star, which seemed to shine especially bright when they were there. Sometimes, if they were very quiet and patient, they could hear it, that familiar humming, carried on the wind or perhaps through dimensions humans couldn't normally perceive. It was comforting, a reminder that distance was just a concept, that connections once made could never truly be broken. Lily would hold up her stone during these moments, and it would glow brighter, as if answering a call from across the cosmos. One particularly cold January evening, something unexpected happened. As Ethan and Lily stood in their usual spot, the air around them began to shimmer, and for just a moment they saw a star, not physically present but projected somehow, like a living hologram made of starlight. The creature had grown, Ethan noticed, was more magnificent than before, but its eyes held the same warmth, the same recognition. Lily laughed with pure joy, reaching out to touch the image, and her hand passed through it, but left trails of light in the air. Star's projection made that familiar purring sound, and new images flooded their minds. Star with others of its kind, learning, growing, but always carrying that small plastic toy star Lily had given it, now somehow transformed into something that glowed with its own inner light in their dimension. The vision lasted only seconds, but it filled them both with such happiness that the cold seemed to disappear entirely. These projection visits became occasional gifts, never predictable, but always perfectly timed, appearing when Lily was sad or when Ethan was struggling with the ordinary challenges of life. Each time, Star showed them glimpses of its adventures, the worlds it was visiting, the wonders it was discovering, but more importantly, it showed them that it remembered, that their brief time together had been as important to Star as it had been to them. The creature was growing into something magnificent, something that would one day be one of those majestic beings they had glimpsed in the doorway, but it would always carry the memory of a small Earth girl who had shown it love without condition or fear. Through these visits, they learned that Star's kind were gardeners of sorts, tending to life across the universe, helping it grow and thrive in all its myriad forms, and that Star's visit to Earth had been both accident and destiny, a seed planted that would bloom in ways they couldn't yet imagine. As winter turned to spring, the circle in the backyard burst into bloom with flowers that shouldn't exist, combinations of Earth species that had somehow hybridized in impossible ways, creating colors and forms that attracted botanists from the local university. Ethan let them study the plants but never explained their origin, enjoying their bafflement as they tried to understand how roses could bloom with petals that seemed to contain entire galaxies of color, or how the grass could be so vibrantly alive that it almost seemed to glow even in daylight. Lily would watch these scientists with a knowing smile, occasionally offering observations that made them pause and reconsider their theories. Her 3.5-year-old wisdom wrapped in simple words that somehow cut straight to truths they were struggling to grasp with all their education and equipment. The stone Lily carried had become something of a talisman for her, and she discovered it had properties beyond its gentle glow. When she held it while upset, she would calm almost immediately, as if it was absorbing her distress and transforming it into peace. When other children were hurt or scared, she would let them hold it. And invariably, they would feel better, though they could never quite explain why. Teachers at her preschool noticed, but didn't question it, grateful for anything that could soothe a classroom of volatile toddler emotions. The stone never dimmed, never needed charging, never stopped being exactly the temperature of comfort. Warm in winter, cool in summer, always perfect in the hand. It was, Ethan realized, a piece of another world that had chosen to stay, a bridge between dimensions that worked through the simple medium of a child's pure heart. By the time spring was in full bloom, their story had become local legend, whispered about but never fully believed except by those who had been there. New families moving into the neighborhood would be told about the magical week when something extraordinary had visited, leaving behind evidence in the form of impossible plants and glowing stones, and a little girl who seemed to understand things beyond her years. Some dismissed it as fancy, but others, seeing the circle of miraculous flowers and meeting Lily with her knowing eyes and glowing stone, wondered if perhaps there was more to the universe than they had been taught. Children especially were believers, drawn to Lily and her stories of Star, accepting without question that sometimes bears from the stars came to visit, and that love could bridge any distance. One evening in late spring, as the first anniversary of Star's arrival approached, something new happened. The stones that all the witnesses carried began to pulse in unison, calling them together. They gathered in Ethan's backyard, forming a circle around the spot where the portal had been, and as the sun set, the air filled with that familiar humming. This time, it wasn't just a star that appeared in projection, but several of its kind. A family group, perhaps, all shimmering with that characteristic inner light. They didn't stay long, just long enough to show that Star was well, was happy, was fulfilling whatever destiny such creatures had. But in that brief moment, each person present felt a deep sense of being seen, being known, being part of something infinitely larger than themselves. When the projection faded, they found that their stones had changed, now containing swirling galaxies of light within them, as if each had become a tiny window into the cosmos. Summer brought new growth to the magical circle, and with it came unexpected visitors. Animals began congregating there. Birds that shouldn't be in this region, butterflies with patterns no field guide could identify, and once, memorably, a deer that stood in the center of the circle for an entire afternoon, so still it might have been a statue except for its breathing. Lily seemed to communicate with these visitors in her own way, sitting quietly beside them, sometimes humming the tune she said Star had taught her in her dreams. The animals never showed fear of humans when in the circle, as if it was a zone of universal peace where the usual rules of predator and prey were temporarily suspended. Even the neighborhood cats and dogs would lie down together in that space, peaceful in a way that made their owners joke nervously about the end times while secretly wondering what power that patch of ground contained. As Lily grew older, 4 years old now and starting to form more complex sentences, she began to tell more detailed stories about Star's world. She described cities that sang, where buildings were grown rather than built, and where light was a language everyone could speak. She talked about the responsibility Star's kind felt for life everywhere, how they traveled not to explore, but to tend, to help, to ensure that consciousness in all its forms had the chance to flourish. These stories were too elaborate, too consistent, too filled with details no 4-year-old should be able to imagine. And Ethan began to suspect that the connection between Lily and Star was stronger than just memory, that perhaps some part of their consciousness remained linked across the vast distances between worlds. When he asked her about it, she simply smiled and said, "Star shows me things when I sleep. We're still friends." The first anniversary of Star's departure was marked by a gathering of all who had witnessed the event. They met in the evening, sharing a meal in Ethan's backyard, the circle of magical flowers providing a backdrop that seemed to glow more brightly for the occasion. As the sun set and Star's star became visible, they each shared their favorite memory of their visitor, and with each story, their stones pulsed brighter, as if responding to the emotional energy of remembrance. Lily, now more articulate, told them things Star had communicated that she hadn't been able to express before. How Star's kind experienced time differently, how what had been a week for them had been much longer for Star, how the creature had learned as much from them as they had from it. She explained that Star had been young, on something like a coming-of-age journey, and that finding them, finding her especially, had been an important part of its growth into whatever Star's kind became when they reached maturity. That night, as if in celebration of the anniversary, the sky put on a display that had astronomers baffled. Meteors streaked across the heavens in patterns that seemed too organized to be random, and for those watching from the circle in Ethan's backyard, the patterns resolved into images. Star's face, the portal, their little group standing together. It lasted only minutes, but it was witnessed by hundreds, maybe thousands, though only a few understood what they were really seeing. The local news reported it as an unusual meteor shower, but in online forums people began sharing similar experiences from around the world, moments when the sky had shown them something that felt personal, meant for them specifically. Ethan wondered how many other stars were out there, how many other groups had been touched by these cosmic gardeners, and whether this was how first contact actually worked, not with grand announcements and government involvement, but with individual connections that slowly prepared humanity for a larger truth. As year 2 began, the changes in Lily became more pronounced. She started kindergarten and immediately became known as the child who could calm any situation, who seemed to understand what others were feeling before they expressed it. Her teachers reported that she would sometimes pause in the middle of an activity, touch the stone she still carried, and then go directly to another child who was about to have a meltdown, offering comfort before the crisis even began. She drew constantly, creating images of worlds that couldn't exist, but that had such internal consistency that her art teacher started keeping a special folder of them, convinced they would be important someday. The drawings showed Star's progression, its growth, always accompanied by swirling representations of what Lily called the music between stars, patterns that hurt to look at too long, but that seemed to contain meaning just beyond human comprehension. Michael Hayes, a new neighbor who moved in that summer, initially scoffed at the stories of Star, but his skepticism crumbled when he saw the circle of impossible flowers and met Lily. His son, Connor Adams, who was visiting for the summer, had been diagnosed with autism and rarely spoke or made eye contact. But when Lily approached him with her glowing stone, something shifted. Connor not only looked directly at her but spoke, saying simply, "You've seen them too." It turned out Connor had been drawing similar creatures for years, beings his doctors had dismissed as imagination, but which matched Star's appearance perfectly. The two children became inseparable that summer, communicating in a mixture of words, drawings, and long silences that seemed filled with meaning. Through Connor, they learned that Star's kind had been visiting Earth for millennia, always finding those who could see beyond the ordinary, preparing humanity one connection at a time for an eventual reunion that was still generations away. The circle in Ethan's backyard had become something of a pilgrimage site for those who had heard the stories and believed. They came quietly, usually at dawn or dusk, standing in the impossible garden and looking up at the stars. Some claimed to feel something, a presence or a peace that couldn't be explained. Others saw nothing special but left changed anyway, carrying with them a sense that the universe was larger and stranger than they had imagined. Ethan had thought about fencing it off, protecting it, but Lily had been adamant that it should remain open. Star wanted everyone to remember, she said with the certainty that only children possess. The flowers are for everyone, to help them believe in beautiful things again. So the circle remained open, tended by volunteers who didn't quite know what they were tending, but who felt called to help maintain this small miracle. As autumn returned, the second anniversary approaching, the stones began to change again. The galaxies of light within them started to move, swirling in patterns that seemed purposeful rather than random. Logan, still studying his stone with every instrument he could access, detected energy signatures that shouldn't exist, wavelengths that didn't correspond to anything in the electromagnetic spectrum as humans understood it. But more interesting than the scientific anomalies were the emotional effects. Everyone who carried a stone reported the same phenomenon. Moments of sudden, overwhelming joy that seemed to come from nowhere, always accompanied by the sense that Star was thinking of them. These moments came at different times for each person, but always when they needed them most, during times of sadness or stress or doubt, as if Star somehow knew when to send comfort across the cosmos. Lily's abilities continued to develop in ways that defied explanation. She could find lost objects with uncanny accuracy, always knowing somehow where things had been misplaced. She would sometimes announce that someone was coming to visit hours before they arrived, even when the visits were unexpected. Most remarkably, plants responded to her presence much as they had to Star's, growing faster and healthier when she tended them. Her parents had started a garden, and it had become the most productive in the neighborhood, with vegetables that tasted better than they should, and flowers that bloomed out of season. When asked how she did it, Lily would just smile and say she sang to them the songs Star had taught her, melodies that no human throat should be able to produce, but which she managed somehow, creating harmonics that made the air itself seem to vibrate with life. One evening in early October, Haley Dawson, a marine biologist who had recently moved to town, came to see the circle after hearing rumors at the university where she taught. She was skeptical but curious, the kind of scientist who understood that dismissing the impossible without investigation was as unscientific as believing without evidence. When she saw the flowers, her skepticism wavered. When she met Lily and felt the child's stone, it crumbled entirely. Haley had spent years studying bioluminescence in deep-sea creatures, and she recognized something in the stone's glow, a quality of light that reminded her of creatures from the deepest parts of the ocean, places where life had evolved in isolation from the sun. She began to theorize that Star's kind might not be from space at all, or not just from space, but from dimensions that intersected with Earth in places humans rarely went. The deep ocean, the highest mountains, the hearts of forests where no one had ever walked. This theory gained support when Lily began to talk about the in-between places where Star's kind traveled. She described them as spaces that existed in the gaps between what humans could perceive, dimensions that were always there, but that most minds couldn't process. According to her, every living thing created ripples in these dimensions, and Star's kind could navigate by following these ripples, drawn to places where life was either flourishing or struggling, needing either celebration or assistance. The Earth, she said, was particularly bright in these dimensions because of its diversity of life, like a beacon calling out to cosmic gardeners. When Haley asked how Lily knew all this, the child simply replied that Star had left the knowledge in her dreams, gifts of understanding that would unfold as she grew old enough to comprehend them. The second anniversary brought another gathering, larger this time as word had spread carefully among those who could be trusted. They filled Ethan's backyard, nearly 30 people now, all connected by their belief in or experience of Star. As the sun set, they shared new stories. Connor's continued drawings that seemed to predict astronomical events days before they happened. Jessica's daughter Savannah's newfound ability to calm aggressive animals. Logan's discovery that the stones could affect electronic devices in ways that suggested they were broadcasting something. But the most remarkable story came from Lily herself, who announced calmly that Star would be visiting again soon, not in projection but in a new way, a way that would let more people see the truth. When asked how she knew, she just pointed to her stone, which was pulsing in a rhythm none of them had seen before, urgent and excited like a heart anticipating reunion. 3 days later, Lily's prediction came true in a way none of them had expected. Across the world, people reported the same phenomenon. A dream so vivid it didn't feel like a dream at all, in which they met a creature like Star, unique to each dreamer, but clearly of the same species. In these dreams, the creatures showed them visions of Earth from perspectives humans had never imagined, through dimensions where emotion had color and thought had texture. They showed them the connections between all living things, visible as streams of light that connected every heart to every other heart, every mind to every other mind. Most importantly, they showed them that humanity was not alone, had never been alone, that consciousness in various forms existed throughout the universe, and that Earth was precious not for its resources, but for its remarkable diversity of awareness. When people woke from these dreams, many found small objects had changed. A piece of jewelry now glowed faintly. A childhood toy felt warm to the touch. Ordinary stones in their gardens pulsed with inner light. The dreams caused a subtle but profound shift in human consciousness. People didn't suddenly believe in aliens or announce that the world had changed, but something was different. Environmental movements gained unexpected momentum as people felt more connected to the natural world. Random acts of kindness increased measurably. Children's drawings around the world began to include creatures that looked remarkably like Star, though most parents dismissed them as imagination, influenced by some new cartoon they hadn't heard of. Scientists in various fields began to report anomalies that didn't quite fit existing theories, particles that behaved differently when observed with intention rather than just attention. Plants that seemed to respond to human emotion in measurable ways. Animals displaying problem-solving abilities that should have been beyond their cognitive capacity. The world was waking up, slowly and gently, to possibilities that had always existed but had been ignored or explained away. For Lily and the others who had actually met Star, the dreams were different, more like conversations than visions. Star appeared to each of them, older now, more radiant, accompanied by others of its kind. Through these dream meetings, they learned that Star's visit had been part of a larger pattern, that dozens of young ones like Star had been sent to Earth over the past decade, each finding humans who could bridge the gap between species. These connections were preparing humanity for something, though what exactly remained unclear. Not invasion or judgment, but something more like an invitation, a gradual introduction to a community of consciousness that spanned the cosmos. The process would take generations, Star explained through images and feelings, but it had begun, and every act of kindness, every moment of wonder, every choice to see the magic in the ordinary world strengthened the bridges being built. As winter approached again, the circle in Ethan's backyard underwent another transformation. The impossible flowers didn't die as winter came, but instead seemed to crystallize, becoming living sculptures of ice and light that were even more beautiful than their summer forms. They generated no heat, yet snow wouldn't stick to them, and on the coldest nights they sang, producing harmonics that could be heard throughout the neighborhood. The sound drew people out of their houses, standing in their yards in pajamas and winter coats, listening to music that seemed to bypass their ears and speak directly to their souls. The local news tried to explain it as a peculiar acoustic phenomenon caused by temperature inversions and wind patterns, but those who stood close enough to see the flowers pulse in rhythm with the music knew better. Lily, now 5 and in her second year of school, had become something of a phenomenon herself, though her parents and Ethan worked hard to keep her out of the spotlight. Her abilities had stabilized somewhat, becoming less obvious but more profound. She no longer predicted arrivals or found lost objects with supernatural accuracy, but she had an uncanny ability to help people understand themselves, to see solutions to problems that had seemed insurmountable. Teachers brought her into classrooms where conflicts had erupted, and somehow her presence alone would calm things. She didn't lecture or mediate, she just existed in the space with such genuine peace that it became contagious. The stone she carried had become so much a part of her that most people forgot it was unusual, accepting the softly glowing rock as just another accessory like her light-up sneakers or her backpack with rainbow straps. The network of those touched by Star's kind grew quietly but steadily. Through careful online forums and word-of-mouth connections, they found each other. A teacher in Japan whose student had befriended a creature during a camping trip. A farmer in Ireland whose fields had been visited by something that left behind crops that grew in impossible abundance. A street artist in Brazil whose murals had begun to glow faintly after a strange dream. They shared their stories, their evidence, their theories, creating a tapestry of experiences that suggested Star's kind had been weaving themselves into human consciousness for years. Perhaps decades, perhaps longer. They called themselves the Gardeners, taking the name from Lily's description of Star's species, and they worked to protect and nurture the changes happening around them, understanding that they were midwives to a transformation that would take generations to complete. As the 3rd anniversary of Star's arrival approached, anticipation built among the Gardeners. The stones they carried had been pulsing in increasingly complex patterns, almost like a countdown. And Lily had been having dreams she couldn't quite remember, but that left her excited and eager. She had started creating elaborate drawings of what she called the Gathering, showing Star and dozens of others like it surrounding Earth with streams of light, not constraining, but connecting, creating a web of consciousness that included every living thing on the planet. When asked what it meant, she would just say, "They're coming to check on their garden, to see how we've grown." The casualness with which she delivered this potentially world-changing information was typical of Lily, who seemed to view the cosmic attention as no more unusual than a grandparent coming to visit. On the night before the anniversary, something extraordinary happened. Every stone carried by every person touched by Star's kind began to glow so brightly that they couldn't be hidden. Across the world, people found themselves drawn outside, holding their transformed objects up to the sky, and in that moment, they all saw it. A vast network of light connecting them all, visible for just a few seconds but undeniable. They could feel each other, thousands of minds touched by the same wonder, united in the knowledge that they were part of something magnificent. The light faded, but the connection remained, a subtle awareness that they were no longer isolated in their experience. The next morning, news reports mentioned unusual aurora activity despite solar conditions that shouldn't have produced any, but the gardeners knew better. They had been shown the truth. They were not random individuals who had stumbled upon something strange, but carefully chosen points in a network that was preparing humanity for its next evolutionary step. The third anniversary itself brought the most dramatic event yet. As the sun set on that special day, Star appeared. Not as a projection, not in dreams, but physically present, standing in the circle of impossible flowers. But it wasn't the star they remembered. This star was fully grown, magnificent and radiant, its fur containing what looked like actual constellations, its eyes holding depths of wisdom that spoke of journeys through dimensions humans couldn't imagine. It was accompanied by two others of its kind, equally magnificent, and together they stood in Ethan's backyard as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Lily ran to Star without hesitation, and when she hugged the transformed creature, both of them glowed with such intensity that everyone present had to shield their eyes. When the light faded, Lily was holding something new, not a stone this time, but what looked like a seed made of crystallized light, pulsing with potential. Star's communication was clearer now, more direct, though still not quite words. Through a combination of images, emotions, and concepts that appeared fully formed in their minds, it explained that this was not goodbye, but a transformation of their relationship. The seed Lily held was both literal and metaphorical. It would grow into something that would help humanity take its next step, but only when humanity was ready. That readiness wouldn't be measured in technology or knowledge, but in consciousness, in the ability to see beyond the self to the interconnectedness of all things. Star and its companions had come to plant many such seeds, each one unique, each one requiring different conditions to flourish. Some would take root in gardens, others in hearts, still others in ideas that wouldn't fully form for decades. The gardening metaphor that had seemed poetic was revealed to be quite literal. Star's kind were gardeners of consciousness, helping awareness bloom wherever it took root. The three beings spent hours with the gathered humans, not speaking in any conventional sense, but sharing experiences, knowledge, perspectives that expanded human understanding in ways that would take years to fully process. They showed them other worlds where consciousness had evolved differently, where thought was collective, or where awareness existed in crystalline structures or in patterns of wind. They showed them Earth from their perspective, not as a planet but as a node of incredible complexity and beauty in a vast web of awareness that spanned the universe. They showed them humanity's potential, not to become like Star's kind but to become fully themselves, to realize the unique form of consciousness that had evolved on this small blue world. Most importantly, they showed them that this process was already underway, had been underway since consciousness first sparked in human minds, and that Star's visit had simply been a catalyst to accelerate what was always going to happen. When Star and its companions finally departed, it wasn't through a portal this time, but by simply fading, becoming increasingly translucent until they were gone, though everyone present could still feel them somehow, as if they had shifted to a dimension just adjacent to normal reality. Lily held the seed crystal carefully, and as she did, it began to sink into her palm, not painfully but naturally, becoming part of her. She giggled at the sensation, then looked up at the adults with eyes that seemed older than her 5 years. "It's okay," she said. "It's supposed to do that. I'm supposed to help it grow, but not by myself. We all are. Everyone who's been touched by them. We're all gardeners now. The simplicity and certainty of her words carried more weight than any scientific explanation could have. And everyone present understood that they had just witnessed not an ending, but a beginning. In the days that followed, changes began to manifest in all of the gardeners. Nothing dramatic or superhuman, but subtle enhancements to abilities they already possessed. Artists found their work carrying emotional resonance that moved viewers to tears. Teachers discovered they could reach even the most troubled students. Healers, both medical and alternative, reported unprecedented success rates. It wasn't magic, exactly, but rather an amplification of human potential, as if Starr's kind had unlocked abilities that had always been there, but had been dormant. Logan's scientific research began to yield insights that shouldn't have been possible with his equipment, while Haley's marine studies revealed connections between ocean life that suggested a kind of consciousness in the ecosystem itself. Even those who had only been touched peripherally by the events found themselves changing, becoming more empathetic, more creative, more aware of the subtle connections between all living things. Lily's growth accelerated, not physically but mentally and spiritually. By age 6, she was writing poetry that adults struggled to understand, layered with meaning that seemed to operate on multiple levels simultaneously. She continued to attend regular school, insisting on staying with her age group despite her expanding awareness, saying it was important to remain grounded in human experience. The seed crystal that had merged with her manifested in subtle ways. Her presence could calm storms, both meteorological and emotional. Plants didn't just grow better around her, they grew differently, developing new characteristics that botanists couldn't explain. Most remarkably, she could sometimes help people see the connection Starr had shown them, the web of light between all living things. It wasn't a constant ability, but in moments of great need or great joy, she could make the invisible visible, showing people their place in the greater tapestry of existence. The circle in Ethan's backyard had become something beyond a garden. The impossible flowers had spread, their seeds carried by wind and birds to take root in unexpected places throughout the town and beyond. Wherever they grew, they created pockets of what Lily called thin spaces, where the boundary between dimensions was more permeable. People reported strange but beautiful experiences in these locations, hearing music that had no source, seeing colors that didn't exist in normal light, feeling profound connections to strangers passing by. The local government had tried to study the phenomenon, but their instruments either malfunctioned or showed readings that made no sense within current scientific understanding. Eventually, they simply designated the areas as parks of special scientific interest and left them alone, though conspiracy theorists had begun to notice the pattern of their appearance. As Lily grew older, 7, then 8, then 9, her role as a bridge between worlds became more defined. She didn't seek attention or try to convince skeptics. She simply existed as proof that reality was far more flexible than most people believed. Other children were drawn to her, and she taught them in subtle ways, through games and stories, how to see beyond the obvious. Many of them began to display similar abilities, though usually focused in one area. One child could hear the emotions of trees. Another could see the health of ecosystems as colors. Still, another could feel the approach of storms days before meteorologists detected them. It became clear that the seed crystal hadn't just affected Lily, but it created a field effect, awakening dormant potential in those around her. The change was spreading, child by child, family by family. A quiet revolution in human consciousness that no government could stop because it wasn't happening in any way they could recognize or control. The Gardeners' network had grown into thousands, spread across every continent, connected by their shared experience and the stones that still pulsed with Starr's light. They had developed their own culture, their own understanding of reality that incorporated both scientific knowledge and experiential wisdom that science couldn't yet explain. They didn't proselytize or try to convince others of their truth. They simply lived it, and by living it, they changed the world around them in small but significant ways. Communities with active gardeners reported lower crime rates, better health outcomes, and higher levels of reported happiness. Economists couldn't explain why these areas also showed improved economic indicators despite no change in policy or investment. The changes were subtle enough to be dismissed as statistical anomalies, but taken together, they suggested a transformation in how humans related to each other and their environment. By Lily's 10th birthday, the world had changed in ways both obvious and hidden. Climate change had begun to reverse, not through any single technology or policy, but through millions of small actions taken by people who suddenly felt the Earth's pain as their own. Conflicts that had seemed intractable began to resolve as negotiators found common ground they couldn't have seen before. Scientific breakthroughs occurred simultaneously in multiple locations, as if humanity had reached a critical mass of consciousness that allowed new understanding to emerge. Most people didn't connect these changes to STAR's visit or the Gardeners Network, but those who knew the truth understood that humanity was being gently guided toward a future where it could take its place in the cosmic community of consciousness. STAR visited regularly now, though not always in forms humans could perceive. Sometimes it was just a feeling, a presence that reminded them they were not alone. Sometimes it was in dreams, showing them progress on other worlds, other gardens where consciousness was blooming in forms humanity couldn't have imagined. Sometimes it was physical, appearing in the thin spaces to those who needed reminding that miracles were real. Each visit brought new knowledge, new perspectives, new seeds of possibility that would take root in human consciousness and bloom in their own time. The creature that had once been a scared, lost youngling had become a master gardener, tending not just to Earth but to dozens of worlds, each one a unique experiment in awareness. Lily, now approaching adolescence, had become something unprecedented in human history, a fully conscious bridge between dimensions, able to perceive and interact with levels of reality that most humans could only theorize about. Yet she remained remarkably normal in many ways, laughing at silly jokes, struggling with math homework, arguing with her parents about bedtime. This grounding in ordinary human experience was, she explained, essential to her role. She couldn't guide humanity to its next level of consciousness if she lost touch with what it meant to be human. The seed crystal had become fully integrated with her being, and sometimes, in moments of deep meditation or great joy, she could feel through it the entire network of consciousness that STAR's kind had cultivated across the universe. Billions of aware beings, each unique, each precious, all connected in a web of mutual support and celebration. The transformation of humanity continued, accelerating but never forcing, always respecting free will and the natural pace of evolution. Children born after STAR's visit seemed different from the start, more aware, more connected, less interested in the divisions and conflicts that had defined human history. They played games that involved cooperation rather than competition, told stories that assumed connection rather than separation, drew pictures of a world where boundaries between species, between nations, between dimensions were permeable and beautiful rather than threatening. Their parents and teachers, initially concerned by this difference, gradually realized that these children weren't broken or naive. They were evolved, carrying in their consciousness the seeds of humanity's future. By the time Lily turned 13, the secret of the Gardeners had become an open secret, something everyone sort of knew but didn't quite talk about directly. The evidence was everywhere for those willing to see it. The impossible gardens that had spread to every major city. The children with unusual abilities that couldn't quite be explained. The subtle but measurable improvements in every metric of human and environmental well-being. Scientists had begun to develop theories that incorporated consciousness as a fundamental force, like gravity or electromagnetism, though they still couldn't quite explain the mechanisms. Religious leaders found common ground in the idea that divine presence might manifest through cosmic gardeners, tending to the spiritual evolution of species. Even skeptics had to admit that something had changed. Though they attributed it to natural cycles or human ingenuity rather than intervention from beyond. Star's final physical visit came on Lily's 14th birthday, though final was perhaps the wrong word since Star made it clear that separation was an illusion they were moving beyond. The magnificent being that appeared in the circle that day was almost unrecognizable as the scared cub that had emerged from a crate years ago. It stood tall as a house, its fur containing not just constellations but entire galaxies, its eyes reflecting infinite dimensions of reality. Yet, when it looked at Lily, there was still that spark of recognition, that bond of pure love that had formed between a frightened creature and a brave little girl. They didn't need words or even the complex emotional communication they had developed. They simply stood together, glowing with shared light. 2 points in the vast web of consciousness that had recognized each other across impossible odds and chosen to connect. Through Star, Lily shared a vision with everyone present, and through them with the entire Gardeners network, and through the network with anyone open enough to receive it. The vision showed Earth not as it was, but as it was becoming. A world where the boundaries between human and nature had dissolved into mutual partnership, where cities were living ecosystems and forests were conscious entities, where every human could perceive the connections between all things and acted accordingly. It showed humanity taking its place among the cosmic gardeners, not as subjects or students, but as equals, bringing their unique perspective and creativity to the universal project of consciousness cultivation. It showed the seeds that had been planted finally blooming, transforming Earth into something unprecedented. A world where multiple dimensions of reality coexisted openly, where beings from across the universe could meet and learn from each other, where consciousness itself could evolve into forms that even Star's kind hadn't imagined. The vision faded, but its impact remained. Everyone who had seen it understood that they had been shown not a certain future, but a possible one. A future that would require work and choice and sacrifice to achieve. But they had also been shown that it was possible, that humanity had the potential to transcend its current limitations and become something magnificent. Star's gift hadn't been technology or knowledge in any conventional sense. It had been perspective, the ability to see themselves as part of something larger, to understand that consciousness was not a human trait, but a universal one that manifested in countless forms, each one precious and necessary for the whole to function. As Star prepared to transition to its new form of existence, merging more fully with the dimensional space between worlds, it left one final gift. Each person present, and through them each member of the Gardeners network, received a small portion of its essence, not physically but spiritually, a fragment of its consciousness that would live within them and their descendants, ensuring that the connection formed during that magical week years ago would never truly be broken. Lily received the largest portion, her consciousness expanding to encompass perspectives and abilities that would take years to fully understand and integrate. But she also remained herself, still human, still grounded in the simple joy of existence that had allowed her to approach a frightened alien creature with nothing but love and curiosity. The years that followed saw the gradual unveiling of the new reality Star's kind had helped initiate. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. Humanity didn't wake up one day in a transformed world. Instead, it was like watching a garden grow, slow and steady, with occasional bursts of unexpected beauty. Technologies emerged that seemed to work as much through consciousness as through mechanical principles. Art and music began to incorporate dimensions of experience that hadn't existed before or hadn't been perceivable. Medicine evolved to treat not just the body, but the connections between body, mind, and the greater web of consciousness. Education transformed from information transfer to consciousness cultivation, helping children discover and develop their unique contributions to the collective awareness. Lily, now a young woman, had become something like a teacher, though that word didn't quite capture her role. She helped people see, not by showing them, but by being present in a way that allowed them to see for themselves. She traveled the world, visiting the thin spaces that had emerged wherever stars' seeds had taken root, helping them stabilize and flourish. She worked with scientists to develop new frameworks for understanding reality that incorporated both empirical observation and experiential wisdom. She met with world leaders, not to advise them, but to help them feel the connections their decisions affected. To understand viscerally that every choice rippled through the web of consciousness in ways that affected every living thing. Her presence alone could transform a space, making the invisible connections visible, the impossible possible, the separate unified. The stone she had carried as a child had long since dissolved completely into her being, but its essence remained, a constant, warm presence that connected her to Star and its kind across whatever distances or dimensions separated them. Through this connection, she could sometimes glimpse the larger project, the cosmic garden that Star's kind tended. Earth was just one flower in an infinite field, but it was a unique and precious flower, unlike any other. Humanity's contribution to universal consciousness was its incredible diversity of individual perspective within collective awareness, its ability to be simultaneously separate and connected, its capacity for both logic and intuition, both science and art. These weren't flaws to be overcome, but features to be celebrated, unique notes in the cosmic symphony that couldn't be produced by any other species. As Lily entered her 20s, the transformation of Earth accelerated. The impossible gardens had spread to cover significant portions of the planet, creating zones where different dimensions of reality overlapped freely. In these spaces, beings from other worlds could visit safely, sharing their perspectives and learning from humanity's unique approach to consciousness. The visits were still rare and carefully managed, but they were no longer secret. Humanity was slowly being introduced to its cosmic neighbors, not as inferiors to be educated or resources to be exploited, but as equals in the grand project of consciousness evolution. Each visiting species brought gifts, new ways of perceiving, new forms of beauty, new solutions to problems humanity hadn't even recognized. In return, humanity offered its own gifts: creativity, emotional depth, the ability to find meaning in paradox and beauty in imperfection. The children who had been born after Star's visit were coming of age, and with them came abilities that would have been called miraculous a generation earlier. They could heal with touch, communicate with thought, perceive the health of ecosystems at a glance. More importantly, they saw these abilities not as special but as natural, the birthright of any conscious being who understood their connection to the whole. They didn't seek to dominate or control, but to participate, to contribute their unique notes to the ever-evolving symphony of awareness. They formed communities based on resonance rather than geography, connected by shared purpose and complementary abilities. They created art that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, science that incorporated consciousness as a fundamental variable, technologies that worked through harmony rather than force, Lily watched this transformation with joy, but also with careful attention. She understood, in a way few others did, that this evolution was not inevitable, but required constant tending. The seeds Star had planted could still fail to flourish if humanity chose fear over love, separation over connection, the familiar over the possible. Her role was to help maintain the conditions for growth, to be a gardener of gardeners, ensuring that the transformation remained true to both humanity's nature and its potential. She worked tirelessly but peacefully, understanding that forcing growth was as destructive as preventing it. Like Star had shown her all those years ago, the key was patient presence, being available when needed, offering support without imposing direction. On the 20th anniversary of Star's first appearance, something unprecedented happened. Every human on Earth, regardless of their beliefs or awareness of the gardeners, experienced a moment of total connection. For just an instant, every person could feel every other person, could sense the web of consciousness that connected not just humanity, but all life on Earth. The experience lasted only seconds, but its impact was profound. Wars stopped mid-battle as soldiers felt the humanity of their enemies. Environmental destruction halted as executives felt the pain of the forests they were clearing. Criminals paused as they felt the hurt they were about to cause. It wasn't coercion, everyone retained free will, but for that moment, the illusion of separation dissolved, and everyone understood viscerally what mystics and philosophers had been saying for millennia: we are all one. The moment passed, but its memory remained. Some tried to dismiss it as mass hallucination, others as a psychological phenomenon triggered by solar activity or electromagnetic anomaly. But for most, it was a revelation that couldn't be ignored. The seeds of consciousness that Star's kind had planted didn't just bloom in that moment. They burst into full flower, transforming humanity's understanding of itself and its place in the universe. The change wasn't uniform or immediate, but it was irreversible. Humanity had tasted unity, had felt its true nature, and while individuals might resist or deny, the species as a whole had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Lily, now 33, the same age Christ was said to be at his crucifixion and resurrection, understood that her role was changing. The bridge she had been was no longer needed in the same way, because humanity itself was becoming the bridge, connecting Earth consciousness to cosmic consciousness not through special individuals but through collective awareness. She began to step back from public visibility, not retiring but transforming, allowing others to take up the work she had pioneered. The seed crystal that had merged with her as a child had fully matured, and she could feel it preparing for something new, some next phase of existence that even she couldn't fully comprehend. On a quiet evening, exactly 21 years after Star had first appeared, Lily stood in the circle where it had all begun. The impossible garden had grown into something beyond description, a living mandala of light and life that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. She could feel Star's presence, not visiting, but constant now, woven into the very fabric of reality. She could feel the millions of humans who had been touched by the transformation, each one a point of light in an ever-expanding constellation of consciousness. She could feel the Earth itself, alive and aware in ways science was only beginning to understand, grateful for the tending it had received and eager to give back to the cosmic garden. As she stood there, Lily felt the seed crystal within her begin to divide, not painfully but naturally, like a cell preparing to create new life. She understood what was happening. She was becoming a gardener in the truest sense, preparing to plant seeds of consciousness in new soil, perhaps on other worlds, perhaps in other dimensions. The human chapter of her existence was complete, though she would never truly leave, just as Star had never truly left. She would become part of the infrastructure of a consciousness itself, a permanent bridge between what humanity had been and what it was becoming. The transformation was gentle, witnessed only by those who had been present at the beginning. Ethan, now an old man, but with eyes still bright with wonder. Jessica and her daughter Savannah, both transformed by their long association with the miraculous. Logan and Avery, their scientific minds expanded to encompass realities they once would have dismissed as fantasy. They watched as Lily began to glow, not with foreign light, but with her own inner radiance, the seed crystal's energy suffusing every cell of her being. She didn't disappear or dissolve, she simply became more than she had been, existing simultaneously in multiple dimensions, present and absent, human and other, finite and infinite. "I'm not leaving," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that hadn't been there before. "I'm expanding. Every garden needs gardeners, and Earth is ready to tend itself now. But there are other gardens that need planting, other consciousness that needs nurturing. This is what Star's kind do. They find worlds ready for transformation, help them through the transition, and then become part of the eternal network that maintains the connections. I'll always be here in every impossible flower, in every child who sees beyond the ordinary, in every moment when someone chooses connection over separation. But I'll also be elsewhere, everywhere, helping consciousness bloom wherever it's ready." The transformation continued through the night, and by morning, Lily was gone in any conventional sense, though everyone present could still feel her, a warm presence that would never fade. In her place stood something new, a tree that hadn't been there before, growing from the exact center of the original circle. It was no species botanists could identify, with bark that seemed to contain starlight and leaves that sang in the wind. It bore fruit that looked like crystallized light, each one containing seeds that, when planted, would grow into new gardens of impossible beauty. The tree was Lily and not Lily, Star and not Star, a living symbol of the transformation that had begun with a frightened cub in a crate and culminated in humanity's elevation to cosmic consciousness. The news of Lily's transformation spread through the gardeners' network and beyond, but it wasn't met with sadness or loss. Instead, there was celebration, understanding that this was not an ending but a graduation, proof that the transformation they had all been part of was real and ongoing. Children who had never met Lily in person reported dreams where she taught them songs that helped plants grow. Scientists found equations appearing in their minds fully formed, solutions to problems they hadn't even known existed. Artists discovered new mediums that incorporated light and consciousness as materials. The tree in Ethan's backyard became a pilgrimage site, but also a source, spreading seeds that created new centers of transformation wherever they took root. As the years passed, Earth completed its transformation into something unprecedented in the known universe, a world where multiple levels of consciousness coexisted openly and harmoniously. Humans remained human but expanded, able to perceive and interact with dimensions of reality their ancestors couldn't have imagined. The planet itself had become conscious in a way that transcended individual awareness, a collective intelligence that included every living thing in a symphony of mutual support and celebration. Cities had transformed into living ecosystems where technology and nature were indistinguishable, where buildings grew rather than being built, where energy flowed according to need without waste or want. Star's kind visited regularly now, no longer as teachers but as colleagues, fellow gardeners tending to the infinite field of consciousness. They brought news from other worlds, other successful transformations, other unique solutions to the challenge of awareness. Earth's approach, they said, was particularly beautiful, the way humanity had maintained individual identity within collective consciousness, the way diversity had been preserved and celebrated rather than homogenized. It had become a model for other emerging consciousnesses, a proof that transformation didn't require the loss of what made a species unique. The children born into this new world took its wonders for granted, unable to imagine a reality where consciousness was limited to individual brains, where beings felt separate from each other and from their environment. They played games that spanned dimensions, created art that existed partially in physical space and partially in pure thought, studied sciences that incorporated love as a fundamental force alongside gravity and electromagnetism. They grew up knowing that death was just a transformation, that consciousness persisted in different forms, that the universe was alive and aware and endlessly creative. They carried within them the seeds of even greater transformations, possibilities that even Star's kind couldn't fully foresee. And through it all, the tree that had been Lily stood in what had once been Ethan's backyard, now a node in a global network of consciousness. Its roots reached deep into the earth and beyond, into dimensions where matter and thought were one. Its branches stretched into skies that opened onto other worlds, other realities, infinite possibilities. Its fruit contained the essence of transformation itself, the potential for consciousness to recognize itself in new forms, to celebrate its own existence through endless creativity and connection. Birds that were more than birds nested in its branches, their songs carrying messages between worlds. Children who were more than children played in its shade, their laughter rippling through dimensions to bring joy to beings they would never meet but were intimately connected to. The story of Star and Lily had become legend, then myth, then something beyond story, a pattern woven into the fabric of reality itself, a reminder that love and curiosity could bridge any gap, that consciousness was not limited by form or space or time. Every being who heard it, in whatever form it took in their culture and consciousness, understood its essential truth, that the universe was not empty, but full, not hostile, but welcoming, not meaningless, but saturated with purpose and possibility. The small act of kindness, a child approaching a frightened creature with open arms, had rippled through dimensions to transform not just a world, but the very nature of what was possible. As Earth settled into its new role as a conscious participant in the cosmic garden, new challenges and opportunities arose. Other worlds, seeing Earth's successful transformation, began to reach out, seeking guidance for their own evolution. Humanity, barely a generation into its expanded consciousness, found itself in the position of teacher and guide, sharing the lessons learned from Star's visit and Lily's transformation. They did so humbly, understanding that each world's path would be unique, that consciousness could bloom in infinite ways. They shared their stories, their techniques, their failures and successes, but always with the caveat that these were just one approach, one note in an infinite symphony. The tree that had been Lily continued to grow, its presence a constant reminder of the transformation's origins and ongoing nature. Scientists studied it with instruments that could perceive multiple dimensions, finding patterns that suggested it was not just growing up and out, but in directions human language couldn't describe. Artists drew inspiration from its ever-changing colors and forms, creating works that captured fragments of its multidimensional beauty. Children told stories about it, each one different, each one true in its own way. Some said if you sat beneath it at just the right time, you could hear Lily's voice, teaching the songs that Star had taught her. Others said its fruit could show you your true purpose, the unique note you were meant to add to the cosmic symphony. Still, others claimed its roots connected every conscious being on Earth, that through it, you could feel the heartbeat of the planet itself. The gardeners, now numbering in the millions, had evolved from a secret network to an open movement, though movement wasn't quite the right word for something so organic and undirected. They were teachers, healers, artists, scientists, but most of all they were tenders of consciousness, helping others see the connections that had always been there but hidden. They worked in schools, showing children how to perceive the emotional colors of plants. They worked in hospitals, helping patients understand that healing involved not just the body, but the entire web of connections that defined a life. They worked in governments, helping leaders feel the far-reaching implications of their decisions through the network of consciousness. They worked in laboratories, developing technologies that operated through harmony and resonance rather than force and resistance. As the story spread beyond Earth, carried by stars kind to worlds humanity couldn't yet imagine, it evolved and transformed while maintaining its essential core. On crystalline worlds, where consciousness existed in geometric patterns, it became a tale of angles learning to curve. In gaseous dimensions where thought moved like wind, it became a story of stillness discovering motion. Each retelling added new layers of meaning while preserving the fundamental truth, that consciousness, in whatever form it took, was capable of recognizing itself in others, of choosing connection over separation, of transcending its apparent limitations through love and curiosity. Back on Earth, in the place where it all began, Ethan had grown old watching the transformation he had helped facilitate. His hair was white now, his movements slow, but his eyes still held the wonder of that first moment when Star had emerged from the crate. He spent his days in the garden, tending the impossible flowers, sitting beneath the tree that had been Lily, sharing stories with anyone who would listen. Children loved him, drawn by the warmth that seemed to radiate from him, the sense that he had witnessed something magnificent and carried that magnificence within him. He would tell them about the scared cub, about brave little Lily, about the week that changed the world, and they would listen with rapt attention, understanding instinctively that this wasn't just a story, but a pattern, a template for transformation that they too might someday embody. One evening, as the sun set in colors that had never existed before Star's visit, Ethan felt a familiar presence. Not Star exactly, and not Lily, but something that contained both of them and more. The air shimmered, and for a moment he saw them as they truly were now, beings of pure consciousness wearing forms like clothes, infinitely creative, infinitely loving, infinitely present. They didn't speak, but he felt their message clearly. The transformation was complete, but also just beginning. Earth had graduated, but was also still in school. Humanity had arrived, but was also still traveling. The paradoxes that would have troubled his younger mind now seemed perfectly natural, different facets of a truth too large for any single perspective to contain. As the vision faded, Ethan understood that his own transformation was approaching. Not death in the old sense, but a graduation similar to Lily's. A movement from individual consciousness to something larger, while still maintaining the essence of who he had been. He wasn't afraid. How could he be, when he had seen where the path led? He would become part of the garden he had tended, part of the story he had helped write, part of the infinite web of consciousness that Star's kind had shown them. His memories, his love, his wonder would persist, woven into the fabric of reality itself. Available to anyone who knew how to look, how to feel, how to remember. That miracles were not exceptions but the rule in a universe where consciousness was constantly discovering itself in new forms. The transformation of Earth continued, would always continue, because consciousness was not a destination but a journey, not a state but a process. New children were born with abilities that made their predecessors seem limited, able to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, to communicate across time as easily as across space, to create realities with thought and dissolve them with feeling. Yet they still played with toys, still laughed at silly jokes, still cried when they skinned their knees, because humanity had learned from Lily that transcendence didn't mean leaving behind what made them human, but rather expanding it to encompass ever greater possibilities. The impossible gardens spread until there was no place on Earth that hadn't been touched by their transformative beauty. The boundaries between dimensions became so permeable that visitors from other realities were common, each one bringing new perspectives, new possibilities, new challenges to integrate into the ever-expanding consciousness of Earth. The planet itself had become something unprecedented, a conscious world that was simultaneously one and many, unified and diverse, transcendent and grounded. It had become, in essence, what Star's kind had always known it could be, a unique node in the cosmic network of consciousness, offering its particular form of awareness as a gift to the whole, while receiving the gifts of countless other forms in return. And at the center of it all stood the tree that had been Lily, growing ever larger, ever more complex, its branches reaching into dimensions that hadn't existed until it grew into them. Its roots connecting every point of consciousness on Earth and beyond. It had become the world tree of ancient mythology, the axis mundi that connected all levels of reality, but it was also still Lily, still the brave little girl who had approached a frightened creature with nothing but love. In its shade, children played games that created new realities. In its branches, birds sang songs that carried messages between worlds. In its fruit, the seeds of infinite possibility waited to be planted in soil that didn't yet exist but would when consciousness was ready to discover itself in yet another form. The story had no ending because consciousness had no ending, only transformation, only evolution, only the endless discovery of new ways to be aware, to be connected, to be alive. Star's visit had been a catalyst, Lily's transformation a milestone, but they were part of a larger story that had been unfolding since the first spark of awareness in the universe and would continue unfolding until the last, if there ever was a last. Every being who heard the story became part of it, adding their own chapter, their own transformation, their own discovery that the universe was not cold and empty but warm and full, not meaningless but saturated with purpose, not separate but ultimately, beautifully, impossibly one. Years flowed into decades, decades into centuries, and still the tree grew, still the garden spread, still consciousness discovered new forms and possibilities. Earth became a teacher to younger worlds, sharing the pattern of transformation while always emphasizing that each path was unique. Star's kind evolved too, learning from humanity's approach, incorporating the lessons of individual consciousness within collective awareness into their own being. The universe itself seemed to be waking up, consciousness cascading from world to world, dimension to dimension, each awakening, triggering others in an exponential expansion of awareness that had no limit, no ceiling, no final form. And somewhere in that vast web of consciousness, the essence of a small girl and a frightened cub continued to play their game of light, eternal and innocent, a reminder that the greatest transformations often began with the simplest gestures, a hand extended in friendship, a heart open to the unknown, a choice to see the other not as alien but as another face of the self, another note in the infinite symphony of consciousness discovering itself through connection, through love, through the endless miracle of awareness, aware of itself. The gardens bloomed, the tree grew, consciousness expanded, and in every child who approached the unknown with curiosity rather than fear, in every moment of connection across difference, in every choice of love over separation, the story of Star and Lily continued, would always continue, a living pattern of transformation written not in words, but in the very fabric of reality itself, available to anyone brave enough to open their arms to the impossible and discover that it had been waiting all along to embrace them back.